here we are once again in the wonderful world of career counseling. And today's topic is aptitude testing. And this is an important topic, although a relatively specialized one. So let me begin by sharing the screen, of course. And here we go. All right, aptitude testing, as in, what can you do? What could you learn to do well? Not so much what you've already achieved, though that may be included, but what are your potentials moving forward? And this raises the question of kind of the similarities and differences between intelligence and intelligence testing on the one hand and aptitude testing on the other hand. When people speak of intelligence, when psychologists at any rate speak of intelligence, they're referring to some sort of general cognitive ability that cuts across or cuts just about anything a person might want to be attempting to do. It's not entirely clear whether there is some real thing, like something corresponding to the megahertz in the CPU of your computer that is intelligence, or whether it's simply kind of a weighted average of how well you do on a bunch of different stuff. But what you're getting is one number, so basically one estimate of overall intelligence. Now, not that that isn't important, but in career counseling, you're not only interested in, how bright am I overall, but also, even more importantly, in where do my strengths and weaknesses lie. So while it may be true that there might be a kind of threshold level of intelligence you need in order to be likely to succeed in various occupations, that's not enough. Perhaps you need a certain amount of whatever intelligence is to become a successful engineer or lawyer or automobile mechanic. But again, who's going to be more successful in each of those occupations is not so much a function of this kind of global aggregate we call intelligence as it is of a profile of strengths and weaknesses. So that's because, you need different abilities to be an electrical engineer than you need to be a lawyer. It's just not the same set of tasks. And some people who might be very good at one might be very poor at the other. So the aptitude tests that career counselors are going to use are typically much less focused on getting this sort of global overall estimate and much more focused on, deriving the sort of zigzaggy line of peaks and valleys so we can zero in on where the peaks are. And we're going to look at a few examples today. So first off, why do it at all? Why engage in aptitude testing at all? Again, it's because different occupations require different highly specific abilities, and we don't all have the same pattern of ability. So, we've all known people who can solve a complex crossword puzzle in 20 minutes, but get hopelessly lost 3 blocks from home. And we've known other people who can kind of mentally map out the entire wiring system of a house and deduce where the short circuit or mouse chewed wire must be, but are not very well able to articulate that, and others, right, with the opposite pattern. And the fact is, we're not always that great at judging our own abilities, though at times, as we'll see later on, that is what, as counselors, will fall back on is people's self-estimations. And the bottom line is, I'm more likely to succeed if I enter an occupation that calls on the abilities that I have developed or have the potential to develop to a higher level. So if you engage with me in some aptitude testing, that can help me narrow my focus, narrow my career search down a bit. I should add here, very importantly, that tests of this sort can also be used at the other end by employers who are looking to screen applicants to see if they want to hire them in the first place, or to sort them out into different career tracks. That's a very different use, and it raises a whole set of issues that complicate life for counselors using these tests potentially. So they sound important, right? I'm going to be better at something that I'm naturally talented at picking up on, and that's likely to make me happier in my life. And so a test could help me about that. But in fact, most career counselors in practice make little use of aptitude tests. It's not a major thing. And that's especially true if you're going to, say, your college career counseling office, or for that matter, seeing a private practitioner if you're an adult, looking for career guidance and paying out of pocket to a private counselor. Least likely to use them. Now, why would that be? Well, why don't we consider using aptitude tests? In the first place, you often, as a counselor, have a lot of the information you would need already available. You don't necessarily need to engage with somebody in an hour or 2 hours of testing to find out. If you're a high school guidance counselor, I mean, come on, you've got access to the entire educational record of the student. You can see what classes they've taken, what grades they've earned, if they've taken any sorts of aptitude tests ever, the results are there. It's all right there. If you're a college counselor, again, you know what, you can look up their grades, you know what they're majoring in, and some majors are distinctly demanding where they're at least at a certain threshold. You have access again to old test scores, et cetera, et cetera. If you're working with adults, you can, to a large extent, estimate ability. This is fraught. You're going to be off sometimes here. But if you know somebody has achieved a certain level of education, or somebody has worked in a certain occupational setting, you know that they've almost certainly at least crossed the threshold for that kind of achievement. So if somebody is a college graduate who majored in economics, you know that there's like a certain amount they have to have going for them in terms of verbal and quantitative abilities in order to have made it that far. If somebody's been working in a certain capacity, you get the idea. Again, you can't. Importantly, you can't say because someone is working in a lower level capacity or didn't go that far in school that they're not, in fact, very, very bright. That's not the case at all. What you can say is that if they are highly educated and or have been working in a high level capacity, they are pretty bright, but there definitely are underemployed and undereducated people out there with a lot of potential to offer us. For them, actually, aptitude testing can be kind of liberating when they, among others, realize, hey, it got more going for me than I thought. That's another story. Finally, look, ability testing, can be time consuming. I've said an hour or two, and I'm not kidding. If you want to do real serious aptitude testing, you're probably engaging with somebody in a couple of hours of assessment, which is time and it's money, it's drawing on limited resources that you or your clients have available. Finally, a lot of clients aren't looking for it. They themselves figure they kind of know what they've got going for them, and they don't really want to go through the testing process. So a lot of career counselors just don't use these tests. That doesn't mean that as career counselors, we shouldn't know about them. Quite the contrary, we should. Among other things, you will sometimes have testing data available to you, which will help you to understand your client's ability profile a bit better. So when are they most likely to be used, and what are the major tests that we're likely to be encountering? The first obvious use is when people are transitioning into a higher level of education. You're going from elementary school into secondary school. You're going from secondary school into college, or potentially from college into some sort of graduate or professional education. Important assessment tools here would include the differential aptitude tests, or DAT, which we'll be looking at in a moment, as well as very famous things like the SATs and the ACT, which many people take in preparation for applying to colleges, and then, of course, the cognate tests that are for graduate and professional schools, the GRE, the MCAT, the LSAT, the GMAT, and so forth. Secondly, again, a very important usage is for people who are seeking military careers. They need to not only be allowed to sign on in the first place, but also they get assigned to various training programs and tasks. Here you have the Asvab. We'll be speaking a little bit about that. Thirdly, you do have adults who come in and they're not very happy with where their occupational life has led them so far. They're wanting to make a change and they're wondering which way to go. Here, the traditional measure is the General Aptitude Test Battery, GATB, which in the 21st century was renamed the Ability Profiler. And again, we'll look at that one a bit, also at some of the disquieting history with that test. So again, with adults, you mostly would only want to use something like the Ability Profiler if you don't have enough information to be pretty clear about what you're looking at, what you would find if you actually did do the assessment. So let's look a little bit at the DATs. This first came out in post-World War II era and was updated repeatedly. The 5th edition came out in the late 1990s, I believe. I don't think it's been updated since then, which is important. It does require several hours to administer, but can be done on a group basis. In fact, I have a distinct memory of this set of tests being administered when I was in the 8th grade, which is a typical place for it to be used. In that case, it's being used for the sort of middle school students, 7th, 8th, 9th grade, going on into so-called senior high school or high school, and it's going to be used to help the guidance counselor work with the student about what their plan of study is going to be. Will you be in a purely academic track? If it's a big high school, will it be the top one or a second tier one? Will you be going for a more vocational kind of program? And if so, what? Business, auto shop, culinary arts, what have you. So the other form of it is for grades 10 through 12, and that again would be in principle used by counselors who are helping you to decide what to do after school. My impression is that the more junior version was always more widely used. I don't have hard data to support that though. But that's the idea. So you're helping to plan the future with your student as a high school guidance counselor, basically. Now, again, my impression, and I don't have hard data to back me up on this, but my strong impression is that the use of this test has declined sharply in the 21st century. And I believe that is largely owing to the extensive amount of testing that has been required under the No Child Left Behind legislation passed during the Bush administration and its various successors. As anyone who's had children in school in that time frame knows, they do a lot of achievement testing. And for some time, it was basically every year you'd have a couple of weeks of just testing and weeks more of preparing for it. And if you're doing all that testing to see how the school's doing and along the way, getting information about what the kids have learned, it really doesn't leave a lot of room to do ability testing and see what they might become good at if you gave them the right education. So for better or for worse, the emphasis really shifted from, one-off use of aptitude tests to multiple administrations of achievement tests. We'll look at a few examples of problems in a moment, but these are the subtests on the DAT: verbal reasoning, numerical reasoning, abstract reasoning, perceptual speed and accuracy, mechanical reasoning, space relations, spelling, and language uses. Importantly, those first two, which are the most clearly school-related, that also demand, intelligence, for want of a better word, putting those together, you get a sort of a scholastic aptitude estimate. But not all of the subtests are related to school, and not all of them are tapping into abilities that academic education is necessarily preparing you for. That's because it's a career test, not a school test. So let's look at just a few sample problems from a few of the subtests. Here we see verbal reasoning. The verbal reasoning subtest is totally made up of analogies, and they're analogies organized in this way, that blank is to something as something else is to blank. So notice it's not something, something is to blank as something is to blank. It's organized a little more difficult and a little more difficult of a fashion. So what is to water as eat is to what? Well, drink is to water as food, eat is to food, right? Well, let's see, supper is to night as breakfast is to morning. Whoever wrote these sample items was obviously hungry when they did it. I didn't write them, but they are make-believe, they're not from the actual test. First is to one as second is to two. Ta-da. So now, basically it's verbal reasoning, though some of the items on the actual test also involve relatively high-level words. So there is a vocabulary piece to it as well. Mechanical reasoning is a very cool test, actually. You have these little drawings of tools or people using tools, and you're asked a question, and it's going to be one or the other, or it doesn't make any difference. In this case, there are two people carrying this piece of heavy equipment. Which one is holding the heavier load? And it is person B, basic principle of physics here, that it's closer to him, so the way the leverage works, that person is carrying more. And all of these, again, are pictorial, and they can be solved, arguably, if you apply your knowledge of physics, but also if you are just a bright, handy person, you'll have figured a lot of this stuff out as you go. So kind of a cool test of an aspect of intelligence that is not so specifically school related. Likewise with space relations. Here you have a shape off to one side, the left, and in principle, it's a shape that could be folded at those lines, at those creases. So you could fold that one into a kind of a box, right? Like a gift box sort of shape. And the question is, which of the four shapes shown off to the right could be that one? So as you look at it, you'll see, the two really big sides are both shaded in, so it can't be A or C. And the two long skinny sides are both blank or white, so it can't be B. Could it be D? Well, yes, because this side could be either, the little short piece could either be white or darkened in, so the answer would be D. So again, not specifically school related, but having to do with that ability to visualize things and work with spatial reasoning. I mentioned before, what about that person who can figure out the wiring of your house, inferentially? They'd be good at this sort of task, and probably also good at the mechanical reasoning task. You have a profile sheet that you get out of this. This is, by the way, truncated. Off to the right, there would be a picture of the normal curve, and the counselor would mark off where you fell on the curve. And essentially, you're marking off where people's scores are on these various subtests, including their percentile ranks. So if you've studied enough about assessment, as all counselors should have, you'll remember that percentile rank is how many people in the general population would fall below me. So if you're at the 90th percentile, 9 out of 10 are below you, 1 out of 10 above. You'll notice that the numbers in the middle are kind of scrunched together, and the ones at the extremes are kind of stretched out. That's because of the nature of a normally distributed variable. Most of us are fairly close to the middle on most variables. So, the difference between being at, say, the 75th and the 70th percentile is tiny, but the difference between being at the 99th and the 95th is actually quite large. So that's the idea. And then the flip side of this feedback sheet gives you a brief explanation of what each subtest is. That's it. We don't need to go through all of them. Let's have a quick look now at the Asvab, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. This is a biggie, because this is required. If you want to join any of the branches of the armed forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, I believe also Coast Guard, you need to take the Asvab. And there is a minimum score required. This varies a bit by service. I think the Air Force sets theirs a little higher because more of the occupations in the Air Force are more technical, but you got to pass the threshold, or honestly, they don't want you. They don't. Back in the day, there were folks in the Army who pretty much did nothing but, carry a rifle and go charging in and get shot at. There were people who spent their time when they weren't doing that, peeling potatoes or whatnot. But that's not how the Army works anymore. There are technical demands. Likewise, in the Navy, you don't have a bunch of people who are just told to pull on a rope anymore. So you do need some degree of brain power for pretty much anything the armed forces are going to train you to do. So they do set a threshold. But more importantly, they're looking, because most of us would cross the threshold, they're looking for the strengths and weaknesses. Now, this is still administered as a paper and pencil test at recruiting stations and sometimes at schools, as we'll see. There also is a computer-based version, which also can be administered at those centers. The computer version can be completed much more quickly because it uses what's known as adaptive testing. But that also can be tricky. So as a person who might take this, you kind of want to ask yourself which way you want to go. It's not going to be the same for everyone. The way adaptive testing works is that the first few questions, which everybody will get, are pitched to kind of a medium level of difficulty. If you do well on them, you're going to get more of those as well as more advanced and challenging questions. If you do poorly on them, you're going to get easier questions to answer. The trouble is, if you are going that route where you're getting easier questions, it is no longer possible for you to get a really high score on the whole Asvab because they've already screened you and decided you're not going to make it that way. So if you're someone who has a lot of test anxiety at first, but you kind of warm up to a task, you might actually want to avoid the computer-based version here. On the other hand, if you value your time and you're reasonably confident that your performance on the first 5 or 10 questions will be indicative of your actual ability, then the computer-based one makes sense. And you may not get a choice depending on what station you're going to be tested at. Now, again, this is offered free of charge because the Navy wants you, right? Or they might want you depending on how you do. They certainly want people. So it's a freebie, and you can either go to a recruiting station and be scheduled to take the Asvab, or possibly take it on the spot, or in some cases, your high school will do it. This is a useful resource for high school guidance counselors who have limited financial resources, whose students are not all going off to college, and they want two things. They want to make it easier for those who wish to join the military to do so, and they also want to have more information about the abilities of all of their students, whether they plan to join the military or not. You don't have to swear you're going to join the Army to take the Asvab. And so they'll come in and give it to all your students free of charge. And furthermore, the recruiting officers, I always say recruiting sergeants, that used to be what they were always ranked as. I think it's different nowadays, but the recruiting officers will engage with your students, or with you if you're the one thinking of joining the military, in a kind of career counseling. I'll have to circle back to that in a moment. So your profile, your strengths and weaknesses, are used to help inform this career guidance. They also, by the way, do administer interest inventories as part of this whole process. So they're also looking at what you might like, but very importantly, they're looking at what you might be good at. Now, I say career counseling of a sort. If you are a counselor and you have a client, you work for the client. And that basically applies even if you are employed by, say, a college or university, and students come to you. You are now working for that student in their best interest. That's your bottom line. If you are working for the military as a recruiter, you arguably try to have your potential recruits' best interests at heart, but at the end of the day, you don't work for them. You work for the Navy or the Air Force or whichever branch you work for. Your bottom line is to fulfill the quotas that the military needs. You need a certain number of people brought on board who are going to be trained to do X job. And that's what you've got to do. So, in the old days, it's a truism, right, from hundreds of years ago that recruiting sergeants lie. In the old days, this was really egregious. They'd get you drunk and have you sign on the dotted line when you could barely see, or when you were unconscious, they'd literally, Shanghai you, drag you off, and you'd wake up in uniform. Or in the really bad old days, they wouldn't even bother talking to you. They'd just hit you over the head, and from the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy, and just drag you on shipboard. It's nowhere near like that anymore. And again, I think many of these men and women do have a counselor side to their nature, but their final loyalty is to the service, not to you. So my advice that I would give to any client who's going to check this out is don't sign anything unless you have a written commitment. Because like here's a dodge you'll sometimes hear about. And I'm not attacking any specific recruiter here, but I've heard of this one more than once. You've gone through the whole process. They're very interested in you. They've chatted you up. They've come and visited. They've probably bought you lunch even, which normal counselors don't do. And so you're talking about it and it's like, yeah, you'd be good as a nurse and the military can train you and get you, fully up to the RN level, and you'd be good as a physical therapist. And again, the Army could train you all up to that. And you got those, and they say, we have to put 3 things down as what you might do. So these are 2 that really came up. And then we have to put in, well, let's just put in this one other. And they put something else. Say, oh, just in case we don't need, blah, blah, blah. The story you always seem to hear is that's the one you end up with. Choice number 3, the one that you didn't actually get all excited about and sign on for. And that once you've signed on, you have no power to negotiate anymore. So be careful. But here are some websites, military.com, join the armed forces, or goarmy.com. You can learn and understand the Asvab. And you can get sort of sample items that give you a sense of what the test looks like. They don't tell you whether you got them right or wrong. They just keep telling you, yeah, great job. Every time you answer one, keep going. But at least it can give you a sense of what you're up against. And you won't be shocked and dismayed by whatever the test actually shows you. These are the subtests: general science, arithmetic reasoning, word knowledge, paragraph comprehension, mathematics knowledge, electronics information, auto and shop information, mechanical comprehension, and assembling objects. Quite a list there. The score that determines whether they want you at all is based on the so-called Armed Forces qualification tests, and that's your sum scores on arithmetic, word knowledge, paragraph comprehension, mathematics knowledge. So basically verbal and quantitative skills. The auto and shop and electronics, by the way, get very, very specific and technical. It'll be like a picture of some tool you never heard of. And what's that? I mean, actually, I shouldn't say you've never heard of, I've never heard of, but some of your clients are going to be like, oh, I know that kind of a widget. That's and such. And they're going to look pretty good for that. And they're therefore perhaps going to look pretty good to be trained to do something like, repair tanks or some other highly technical, important job. All right, last, not least, probably the Asvab is the most important of these, but last and not least, the General Aptitude Test Battery, as it was once known. This, again, is a government product like the Asvab, in this case put out by the U.S. Employment Service, a much smaller and not nearly as well-funded organization as the military, obviously. First came out, again, in the near aftermath of World War II, and the nation was expanding in many, many ways. And it has been revised a couple of times since then. And originally, actually for many years, it was used for 40 plus years, both vocational guidance, career counseling, and job placement. Up until about 30 years, just over 30 years ago, as I record this, this was very widely used. It was administered to over 500,000 people a year, most often at state-run employment agencies. This would be a bitter history here coming up, but it was later renamed the Ability Profiler. So if you encounter it nowadays, in the United States, it'll be the Ability Profiler. I believe they continued to use it under the name GATB in Canada for quite some time. I'm not sure if that's still the case. These are the subtests. A pretty familiar list by now, isn't it? Arithmetic reasoning is there, and computation. So, the distinction here is between sort of your understanding of mathematics and more word problem-y sorts of things on the one hand, and, just doing computations with straight up numbers on the other. There's a vocabulary test. There's another of these spatial tests with the folding of stuff. And a couple of very clerical tests like name comparison, mark making, object matching. And then there are the subtests that involve like pegs in boards and putting things together. Those were often not administered because a lot of folks just aren't interested in, manual labor, factory work. And frankly, for a number of years now, you can't even buy the equipment if you're setting up a practice. So you'd have to go to an office where they still have it, one of the employment services. Now, what's the better history here? It starts with a dilemma. And this is the history of the so-called race norming controversy. It starts with a dilemma. Members of certain minority groups have tended historically to obtain lower scores on ability tests, including the GATB. Now, because this was being used for guidance and placement alike, fewer minority group members would therefore be recommended, moved in the direction of pursuing higher prestige occupations, things that require higher ability levels, management positions, professional positions, higher level technical positions. The folks who were working on the GATB came to recognize that this was a problem, and it was a problem for two reasons. One of these was that as of when this controversy, when this whole thing began, we're talking early 1970s now, circa 1970, there was really little or no direct evidence that the tests predicted success in various occupations. There was all indirect evidence. People in occupations had certain average levels of abilities, et cetera. But if you don't have clear evidence to support the test's validity, that is predictive validity, then if the test scores are discriminating against minority group members, that would be discriminatory. Secondly, and this is the really tricky one, which we'll get to in a bit, minority group members who would have succeeded if they were actually allowed to enter an occupation would be more likely to be dissuaded from going that way, not guided in that direction, and more importantly still, not hired by employers using the test as a screening test. So in 1972, several government agencies got together on this. The Department of Labor was taking the lead because they're the ones developing and using this test, but they got the DOJ, Department of Justice, involved, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and they agreed, here's the quote, referrals of tested minority applicants should be in proportion to their presence in the applicant pool in all cases in which the tests had not been validated for minority applicants for the job in question. So in other words, if 20% of the people seeking entry into an occupation were members of a certain minority group, then as many of them should be moved ahead, hired or promoted or what have you, as in the so-called majority population, assuming that the tests haven't been specifically validated for that minority group. Okay, next chapter. They start doing the validity studies. So in the 1970s and 80s, the GATB was validated for minority groups. Mostly we're talking about African Americans, Black Americans, by the way. And they did the studies, and the predictive validity was about the same as it was for white people, the majority at the time. Predictive power was moderate. It's not like your score on an ability test is the only thing that matters to your success on the job, but it was there, and the validity evidence was there. And the GATB, meanwhile, was being revised. And in large part, the revision was fueled not only by the need to update, but equally important, or more important perhaps, to eliminate what's known as test bias, which we'll circle back to as well. So they did that. Unfortunately, group differences remained. They were unable to eradicate in particular, the Black-white differential on test scores. So here's the dilemma they had. And it's a real dilemma. I mean, this is truly the horns of a dilemma here. If you put everybody in the same pool, majority and minority group members alike, then minority groups that have a history of being discriminated against would find their progress slowed. They would be more disproportionately likely not to be encouraged or allowed to move on. That would be discriminatory. That's a civil rights violation. On the other hand, if you use separate norms, if you say, well, we're going to have the white norms and we're going to have, say, the black norms, then that violates the principle of equal protection under the law for members of the group or groups who score higher on the test. Ouch. The way Linda Gottfriedson put it, and by the way, her work in this domain is quite controversial, but this is a well-turned phrase. The disparate impact and disparate treatment standards will create mutually contradictory demands as long as racial ethnic groups continue to differ substantially. So at this point, Department of Labor said, all right, we're going to go with the separate norms approach. We have to pick one or the other. We're going to go with that. This came to be known as race norming. And they said they're doing this for two reasons. One, remember, the GATB is not a perfect predictor of job performance. So, that's fine. It's not perfect. So you shouldn't, you still can justify under the 1972 rule, limiting its use in some ways. Secondly, this is going to be the kind of mind-bending technical piece for today. When you use combined norms, even though the test is equally valid for members of both groups, it still is going to have a disparate impact on minority groups. Okay, deep breath. Here we go. I'm going to illustrate this with numbers that are basically make-believe, but this is exactly the way it works out in practice. So let's assume we have a standard issue ability test, like an IQ scale. The mean for the general population is 100, and the standard deviation is 15. But members of our selected minority group obtain significantly lower scores with a mean of only 85 and the same standard deviation. So there is a substantial, a one standard deviation difference between the two groups. That approximates where the black-white differences were. Okay, now the test has been studied, and we have found that if you're going to succeed in a higher level occupation, we'll say management, that the best cutoff score we'd have would be a score of 100. So in other words, if you score 100 or better on the test, then we would consider you for a management track position. If you score below 100, we won't. And we have empirical evidence that the people scoring above that level, 90% of them will succeed. Again, this is fictitious, but not unlike the reality in some ways. Mathematically, it's exactly the same thing would happen no matter what numbers you plug in, by the way. Okay, so among your majority group, half are going to score above 100 because that's just the dead middle. So 50% of them could get referred in to management track positions. And that means, and of them, 90%, would succeed. So 45% of the majority group could not only be tracked in that direction, but make it. In the minority group, though, only, and this is just the mathematical nature of the normal curve, only 15% would be considered suitable and tracked into it. And again, 90% of them will make it. So only about 13.5% of your minority group members will make it. Now, so far that's sad, but perhaps it's fair, perhaps. But look what happens next. There isn't a magic cliff that you fall off. The score goes below 100 and now you're guaranteed to fail. So it's not like everybody here succeeds, everybody here fails. What you have is fewer and fewer people succeeding. So the optimal cutoff mathematically was at 100, but the people who are pretty close to that, say in the 90 to 99 range, well, quite a few of them would make it. And maybe the research shows, again, made up numbers, that 60% of them would succeed. All right, well, between 90 and 100, you've got about 25% of the majority group. And so if you were to go ahead and put them in, another 15% would succeed, all told. Among the minority group, 22% of them are in that range. So if you move them in, a little over 13% would succeed. Now notice what's happened here. If we, by excluding people in this 90 to 100 range, only 1 in 4 of the majority group members who could have made it won't get the chance. But just about 1 in 2 of the minority group members who would have succeeded won't get the chance. So you're having twice the likelihood of rejecting a minority group member who would succeed. Even though the test is valid, even though the test is fair, it has this disparate impact. Where do these differences come from then? Oh boy, there's a fraught subject if ever there was one, highly controversial subject. But look, there's at least 4 possible sources here. One of them is test bias. Specifically that some of the items on the test are differentially biased for or against members of one group. This used to be a really big problem that just about nobody looked at, quite honestly. I think because the folks developing the tests were just about all from the majority white population, they didn't even notice if there was a bias against somebody other than themselves. Until late 1960s, finally, psychology sort of woke up here to this as a serious problem. And since then, great efforts have been made with considerable success, not total, but considerable success to eliminate test bias and specifically to look for those problematic items that are performing differently for members of different identifiable groups. So that was a huge factor. It has diminished. It's no longer a big factor, I think, nowadays. Probably still there to some extent, but believe me, test publishers work overtime trying to get this out of their tests because it's only trouble to them if they have large group differences. The second source, and it's an obvious one to everyone who isn't some kind of white supremacist, in my opinion, is straight up socioeconomic status. If I belong to a group that has historically been oppressed, I am statistically more likely to come from a family that is poor. I'm likely to have less access to better, higher education or just better schools in general, and that's going to hold me down. There's a very powerful effect of socioeconomic status and where you live and where you go to school and how many books are in your house and how many are in the local library and whether you have high-speed internet access, et cetera, et cetera. A very powerful effect on test scores here. That's a big, big contributor to the test score difference we're looking at. And again, since this is an historical abuse, one would hope to take steps to remedy it. A third possible source is genetic differences. If you have ethnic groups that have to some extent bred separately for hundreds or thousands of years, there will be differences. And there are those who argue that this includes really big differences in abilities. There are respectable authorities who argue that this is a major source of the ethnic differences we do see in test scores. I'm not one of them. I would argue that although small group differences are plausible, they'd be on the order of maybe like 3 IQ points, not 15. Large ones are just highly improbable. Straight up Darwinian theory says, why would you have a huge portion of the human species selectively breeding to be less intelligent than others? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Again, it's out there, it's an ongoing and bitter controversy. And my side of the opinion, this can only be professional opinion because the evidence can be interpreted in different ways, is that this is not a major factor. The fourth possibility is that being discriminated against may have an actual negative effect on my cognitive functioning, at least under certain circumstances. And to some people, mostly probably white people, to some people that sounds improbable, but let me point out 3 lines of research that show where this can happen. The oldest of these relates to something known as an experimenter expectancy effect, which was first described by Robert Rosenthal way back in the 1960s. Rosenthal was a professor up at Harvard, and he was running an undergraduate class where the students, among other things, were training rats to run mazes, 1960s behavioral psychology. And he told his students it was going to be an interesting year because half of the teams were going to get specially bred maze bright rats, ones that had been bred for like 5 generations to be smart at solving mazes. That is something that's been done, by the way. And the other half were going to get maze dull rats that have been selectively bred to basically be stupid. And in fact, by the end of the semester, when they'd compiled all the results, the students who had maze bright rats had rats that had solved the mazes more quickly, made fewer errors, et cetera, than those with the maze dull rats. Only then did Professor Rosenthal reveal that all the rats were just straight up plain old lab rats from the same families, the same breeding pools. They were not selectively bred rats at all. Something about the students' belief about the rat they had changed the outcomes, and literally changed the outcomes. I mean, literally, not only were they internally biased, but literally the rats solved the mazes faster over the course of the semester. Rosenthal then did a study that it's been criticized and attacked, and it would be very difficult to replicate this because people would be too savvy nowadays. But it's a very provocative experiment in which he went into schools and informed teachers that certain of the students in their class, based on a fancy test that Harvard had developed and given all the students, that these students were about to blossom intellectually. This was going to be their big year of intellectual growth. So watch that child. Let's see what happens. And indeed, those children who were identified by Rosenthal as about to bloom not only did better in school, but did better on standardized tests of achievement and intelligence by the end of the year. And as you've probably guessed, the predictive test was a fake. These students were randomly assigned to the condition of this one's going to bloom. So something about what the teacher believes changes how you actually perform. Now, it hopefully doesn't take too much of a leap for you to see the parallel with stereotypes about different ethnic groups that teachers may not be immune to, and the impact that may have over the course of not a single academic year, but your entire career in preschool, elementary school, and secondary school on the developing abilities of members of groups who are thought, however incorrectly, to be less able. That's huge, right? A second issue, and these are kind of interweaving, by the way, they're not all totally separate from one another, but a second issue, which has been studied quite a bit in the 21st century, is a so-called stereotype threat. You see this most often in studies of males versus females going into science. The gist of it is, if you put me in a situation that activates negative stereotypes about the group I identify with, I do less well. I guess when I was a kid, we would have said psyched, as in you got psyched out. Basically, that's what stereotype threat is all about, is we get psyched out this way. So if you have the stereotype, not only the teacher now, but the student, if the student holds the stereotype that, I'm a girl, I'm not going to be good at math, or I'm Black, I'm not going to be good at science, right? However incorrect that might be, your belief in that stereotype, even if you don't verbalize it to yourself, will actually damage your performance. There are ways of trying to counteract stereotype threat, by the way, which is a subject for another day, but one well worth looking into. One of my favorite little studies here from just before the turn of the millennium was an experiment in which the researchers developed a task that you could look at as more of an intelligence test, or you could look at as more of an athletic ability test. So it involved like doing a sequence of physical moves, basically. It wasn't dance moves, but something like that. And if you presented it to research participants as an intelligence test, the white participants did significantly better than the Black participants. But if you presented it as an athleticism test, the Black participants did better than the white participants. Same test, different stereotypes. Third thing to bear in mind, and this is one where I'm kind of drawing an inference an analogy from work that's been done in economics, has to do with the impact of so-called cognitive load on your reasoning, and in this case, cognitive load that's caused by worrying about stuff. So here's the basic experiment. You have people, you recruit wherever, and some of these studies were literally done in shopping malls and the like, so it wasn't all a bunch of university students. You have people think about a financial decision they need to make, like, their car is going to need a $500 repair, that kind of thing. Or you don't. And you have them then, while they've just been thinking about this decision and what they're going to do about it, perform cognitive tasks. Well, people who are relatively affluent, they're given this little thing about what are you going to do about the car, and okay, and then they do, cognitive tests. It doesn't really have any impact on them compared to how the similar participants who didn't get hit with the worry do. But less affluent people, it has a big impact. So that, just having had that on your mind, even though it's make-believe, just having had it on your mind a few minutes ago has a depressing effect on your ability to perform cognitive operations, your ability to think and reason. Now, here's where I'm drawing an analogy. It's not just SES, but what if I have to walk around all the time kind of half expecting that I'm going to be treated badly because of the color of my skin or the shape of my eyes or my nose or something? Wouldn't that kind of fretting and worrying, totally understandable, also potentially have a negative impact on my cognitive functioning? Now, again, you can see all of these are sort of weave in together, but these are most likely, other than socioeconomic status, the major drivers of these differences that we're seeing. So back to the race norming issue. Here we go. So at the end of all this research, blue ribbon panel was put together. Hartigan and Wigdor headed the team, and they put out a book-length report on fairness and employment testing. That's the web link. If you just look it up, Hartigan, Wigdor, fairness and employment testing, you'll find the site. You can download the whole book free of charge from the National Academies. The conclusion of all these researchers was that the GATB should continue to utilize separate norms for identifiable groups. That's the conclusion. Then somebody writes an article for a major conservative magazine, the National Review, called Big Brother's Test Scores. And in about the same time, Linda Gottfriedson, remember her, I said she was controversial in this area, writes a letter to the New York Times, which was duly published: hiring quotas exist, but employers won't tell. So now, white Americans are learning that there's some kind of reverse discrimination happening here, or something like that. And this becomes great fuel for the fires of conservative politics. And by the way, let me say, I am sympathetic to the position that it seems unfair to me if I obtain a certain score on the test that you're using to decide who gets a certain job opportunity, that somebody else who may have had a lower score than I gets the opportunity and I don't. Like, I scored 95, this guy scored 90, you're telling me I didn't make the threshold, you're telling me he did. I do get that. There's no way this isn't uncomfortable. There's no way it isn't. It's an attempt at not only redressing historical wrongs in the interest of fairness and justice, but also building up over the course potentially of 2 or 3 generations, building up the expertise in the American labor pool. We are underutilizing a large part of our population that has not only been discriminated against, but has suffered the consequences on multiple levels. That's, again, an opinion, but I do understand that there's an uncomfortable quality to this. So anyway, conservatives in Congress and the Reagan and later the first Bush administration were outraged and kind of did a lot with this. You can look up a lot of the newspaper articles from the that period, late 80s, early 90s here. And as part of the so-called Civil Rights Act of 1991, race norming was outlawed, banned. Department of Labor didn't see a way out of this. So they, for the time being, simply withdrew the GATB from circulation. I mentioned before, it continued to be used in Canada, but in this country for a number of years, it was just off the table. Then it was reintroduced in the early 2000s, so about a decade or so later, renamed as the Ability Profiler. Part of that is, I think, a little smoke and mirrors. Let's not, poke the bear and wake them up on this. But what they also made clear was that the Ability Profiler should only be used for counseling, not job placement. And see, that gets them around the race norming ban, because as a counselor, you may know that there's a tendency for certain minority group members to score a bit lower, but nonetheless to have potentially the ability to succeed. So you take that into consideration as you counsel your individual clients. On the other hand, though, if it's only there for counseling, it's not going to get used nearly as often. And on top of that, budgets for DOL kept getting cut and cut and cut. It can be hard to find a DOL employment center. Finally, in late 2021, just last year, as I record this, the Ability Profiler was officially retired, meaning that they're no longer going to update it, or support the software because you can, by the way, as counselors, you can download this and administer it in paper or pencil form, as long as you believe yourself to be qualified to do so. You also can, there's code available, you can set it up to be available online, but there's no longer going to be any tech support or any updates. So it's going to continue to be used for a while, but it's going to be used less and less. It's now on the way out. Sad story, actually, isn't it? Now, what has come to be into existence as a kind of alternative, limited, but an alternative, is something called the skills profiler. This, again, is a thing put out by the government, and it's available online through the California Career Zone. That's a state-funded nonprofit. And that's the website there. We'll have a look at it in just a moment. It's a self-assessment of skills. There's a total of 35 questions on it, and you answer each one on one of those 7-point Likert type scales. So you get scores on each of the 35 items. Each item is about how good are you at this? And they're also organized into 6 higher level clusters of abilities. Now, if you happen to be someone who is pretty insightful about what you're good at and not so good at and how you measure up compared to the next guy, and if you happen to be motivated to be truthful and forthcoming, this actually isn't a bad substitute for doing ability testing. The drawbacks here, of course, are double. You might have clients who are going to look to puff themselves up unrealistically, even though down the road it's just setting themselves up for failure. You also have people who greatly overestimate, less often underestimate, more often overestimate their abilities. And unfortunately, there's a classic study here from, again, the turn of the millennium. The people who are less able are more likely to greatly overestimate their abilities. So, that's a kind of a problem. If I'm at the low end of the ability pool, I'm likely not to realize it and to think that I'm actually in the high average group when I'm really not. So there are drawbacks here, but let's have a peek together at the skills profiler. So, here's the introduction, and we can simply say go, or we can enter our scores from a previous administration. Let's look at what it looks like. We won't do the whole thing together. I encourage you to try this yourself sometime. So, they give you instructions. It's like what to do, what to do, what to do. It's not a test. There are no right or wrong answers, blah, 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 35 questions, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so here's the first question. To what extent, in thinking about my past experiences, at what level do I possess this skill? The first question is the skill of active learning. And you'll notice I have choices, right? So, and they give you these little anchor points. We'll have a look at some examples separately on the slideshow, actually. So we'll come back to this. So Here's another example, negotiation. And the anchor points are given at levels 2, 4, and 6. So you're not just sort of globally like, oh, you're sure about a 5, but you're looking at examples of what you probably should have done or something like that to qualify at that level. So have you ever tried to justify to a manager changing your work schedule? Changing away from shift work or getting rid of that one overnight a week or whatever it happens to be. But whether you succeeded or not, if you've tried, that at least gets you to the level 2 threshold or anything comparable to that, right? Negotiating your salary before being employed, anything of that nature. Contracting with a wholesaler to sell its goods at a given cost gets you up to level 4, the mid-range. Work as an ambassador, negotiating a new treaty puts you up at level 6. So the 6s can be hard to reach for a lot of these. Managing personnel resources, level 2, it's like, have you ever encouraged your coworker who's struggling, right? Level 4, have you directed the activities of a road repair crew or without disrupting traffic? And by the way, that could mean any sort of, ground level management position, like telling the people in the fast food restaurant which way to go and when to hit the grill and which way to do something else. 6, you're up to plan, implement, and manage recruitment, training, and incentive programs. Wow. So you see how it goes, right, in each case. I self-rated myself. Some of these might be a little high, who knows, because we all puff ourselves up a little bit. But I am a college professor with a PhD in psychology. So yeah, I rated myself pretty high on complex problem solving and on the basic skills, which are, things like reading and writing and arithmetic. Moderately high on social skills. I was trained in clinical psych after all. I should have some. And, kind of low average on systems skills, research management skills, and a little on the low side, technically speaking. Now, if you plug in your scores, it generates a list of results. So you can just click at the end and say, what are the occupations suitable to my skills? And it kind of rank orders them, though I wouldn't put too much weight on small differences here. And that's going to vary. Again, remember the idea from a previous presentation about different educational levels. You can filter it that way. Altogether, I had 870 occupations that popped up, but if I narrowed it down, say, to ones that require a graduate degree, that number gets a lot smaller. As it happens, my top 20 did include things like clinical psychologist and psychology professor and other sorts of professor and pediatrician. So, a lot of things that are pretty close to what I do or what I definitely want to do. Things that require less education that popped up were things like medical assistant, coroner, eligibility interview for government programs, that sort of thing, which don't require even a college degree. So you get ideas to follow up on, is the idea. So the bottom line, aptitude testing has been part of career counseling for a long time. This is an area of overlap between career counseling and job placement or personnel work. So the same tests may be used for both purposes in some cases. The results of aptitude testing can be very useful. They can help to guide people into occupations or career paths where they're likely to succeed. However, you should not use the results as the sole or primary basis for career choice. What I would say to you always is, if your client has scores that come out low for an occupation that they're interested in, you should not say, these results mean you can't do it. There are too many cases where that's happened. I have been at talks. I remember once at an American Psychological Association talk, and a PhD school psychologist standing up there saying, that his high school guidance counselor told him he would never be able to make it and graduate from college. And here he is as a PhD licensed and certified as a school psychologist. You don't want to be that career counselor and have the guy come back and say, remember me? And you also don't want to be that career counselor because you're just not helping people, you're hindering them. So you don't say that. What you can say is, and I'm using lawyer as an example here. Now, lawyers, of course, need to have excellent reading skills. Now, based on how you did on the test last week, you got some need to grow in that area. So what's the plan? How can we put together an educational plan that will help to bring your reading up to the level that a lawyer is going to need? So treat it as not as this is your ability and you're never going to change, but rather as, here's what's kind of getting in your way. Can we build that up, or is there a way to do an end run around it? Right? Because also in addition to getting to be better at reading, there can be ways, some things can be recorded for you. If you have excellent auditory learning abilities, you can actually do a great deal in college just by listening closely to your professor's lectures and memorizing everything in real time. A lot of dyslexic reading disabled students have gotten very good at that sort of thing. So you present it as a work in progress rather than a fixed sum, so to speak. And then, it's up to your client, right? If they're saying, oh, I don't want to do that, that sounds really boring, or, it's going to be hard, that's fine. It's like, okay, well, don't forget, it might be possible for you to do this if you're willing to invest that kind of work. But you're saying it doesn't sound like a good plan for you now. And that's fine too. So let's see. What attracted you to the law? I wonder who else does that sort of work. And in other words, find out what they were interested in doing in the first place that led them to wanting to be in that occupation. And then you'd look for ones in job zones that require less education, basically. And that concludes our presentation for the day. So we will say good day to you and see you next time.